Good afternoon. The purpose of this video is to help you understand the mind-body identity theorem. And in order to help make it a bit clearer, I thought I'd focus on the quote by J.J.C. Smart. J.J.C. Smart, he is a very famous Australian philosopher, and he's one of the major proponents of this kind of quite straightforward idea in many ways of saying that we should think of the mind as just being the same thing as the body. The mind, everything about the mind can be understood as part of the brain. So by the body we mean brain, yeah? So the mind, obviously we, as humans, we came to understand the mind from our own experience. We came over time to understand the brain through anatomy and study. And it just so happens that this thing, the mind that we have, is just the same thing as the brain. So the mind and the brain is just the same thing. It's identical. It's exactly and precisely the same thing. We came to understand this thing through two different ways. One, through our inner experiences, coupled with our language, coupled with then our discussions with other human beings, and we came up with this shared notion of the mind. I have a mind. And then we come and understand what the mind is. But that thing just happens to be exactly the same thing as the brain that we all came eventually to understand we had. Because, of course, originally, you know, as our ancestors would have run around in forests as hunter-gatherers, we wouldn't have known we had a brain. It's only with science that we've come to understand that the brain exists. And actually, we would have understood we had a brain before we then understood that actually the brain is the thing that is the mind. And presumably we would have understood we had a mind very early on. We'd have had this, I'm thinking, way before we understood we had a brain. But as time has gone on, we've understood that, this thing that is the brain, that's the mind. And so this is what the theory is. One way of explaining it is to think of, everything, or to understand J.J. Smart's quote. He talks about ontological danglers. And that's quite a nice concept to unpick. So all of science is slowly, everything in the world is slowly being understood more and more in physical terms. You know, we started off thinking that the sun was this mystical thing that travelled across the sky, maybe part of a wheel of a chariot or something. We had all sorts of myths and reasons, belief in magic and all sorts of crazy things that we thought about how explaining the world. But eventually we've come to understand everything in terms of science. And we've come to understand everything can be explained then in terms of even more fundamental science. Even biology, well, that can be understood more and more in terms of biochemistry, understanding the chemicals that are in action. So when we understand biology, we're really zoning in precisely on what chemicals are working in such a way, and then we understand, well, that can all be understood in terms of the molecules inside them and the actual atomic structure. So everything is following the causal laws of physics ultimately. And this idea, everything that we've come across, and increasingly in the world, we can understand in terms of this, this understanding of physics ultimately. Now, it would seem strange and remarkable that there is just this one set of things, the concepts of the mind, that can't be explained like this. And that would seem strange. Everything else that we've come across can be explained in terms of the causal laws of biology, chemistry and physics. And for these things not to be able, so for these things to exist that can't be explained in this way, unlike everything else, animals, plant life, the planets, the solar system, everything can be explained in terms of these. As we're learning about new galaxies, we're finding more and more that they seem to be following the basic rules and laws that apply on Earth and our own solar system. So it seems strange that there was this odd type of thing called mental things that don't follow these rules. And so therefore he says that if it was such a case that the mental things can't be described in terms of physical laws like chemicals in the brain moving and responding, neurons flying around in a certain way. If that isn't the case, and there are these strange mental things that can't be explained exactly as the body, then they would be ontological danglers. They'd be completely different to pretty much everything else that there is in the world. They wouldn't, they'd be of a very strange nature at all. So it makes much more sense to think, well, everything that is mental, actually, ultimately, once we do understand it, is nothing but a physical process, a physical reality. The mind and the body, i.e. is the brain, and it's just the same thing. And we've come to realise that just like everything in the animal world, biology can ultimately be, and chemistry can ultimately be broken down and explained in terms of the physics of what's going on in the particles that are zooming around inside these life organisms. In a similar way, the mind surely must ultimately, eventually, we will be able to describe and explain in this way. So any mental phenomenon ultimately is just a physical phenomenon, and it's just a question of us learning enough about neuroscience to be able to precisely identify. So when you're trying to explain this, obviously you can go into detail, you can talk about talk about the content I've just mentioned there, and then you can start giving examples. You can start talking about, okay, let's take, I think some of the ones I've used, let's take anger. So anger is a mental state. But what is anger? Well, anger is just when maybe part of our brain, maybe the front part of our brain that directs our kind of our impulses, suddenly starts overriding other parts of our brain that are more reason based. And actually that is what anger is. Anger is when part of the brain, the impulsive part, starts overriding and taking control away from the decision-making part of the brain. And that's what anger is. And the challenge would then be, well, we need to be able to explain all mental phenomena in this way. And if we can explain all mental phenomena in this way, then the mind-body identity theory holds. Now, of course, if we can't explain it all in this way, it might be that we become an eliminative materialist. That's the topic for this week. So the eliminative materialist might say, well, some things can be reduced, but other things we need to eliminate. Let's stop talking about certain aspects of our mental thing because they're just hocus pocus, they don't exist. But going back to the mind identity theory and J.J. Smart, what he would say is every mental phenomena can be understood and explained in terms of the physics of what is happening with the chemicals in the brain and the neurons as they zoom around connecting parts of the brain, and that is just a physical process, and everything that is in our mental world can be explained in this way. There's an identity going on here, and it's a precise identity, exact. It's a quantitative identity. The thing that is the mind just so happens to be the thing we've discovered separately is the brain. It's the same thing. And it kind of reduces, all mental things can be reduced to physical processes. And there you go. Well, obviously you can, if that doesn't enable you to give you enough material to write your section, then I think the next thing to do, of course, is then to go through the 5 objections. And of course, you might just come up with your own objections to that. And obviously, the work this week, with Patricia Churchland, she actually gives a nice objection, which you can pick up and throw in if you want. I'll leave that to you because that's the work you're supposed to have done today. And I quite like the video of Patricia Churchland. Okay, well, I hope that helps, and good luck getting the work in for Friday on that, on the mind identity theory, which is the first of our physicalist theories that we're going to look at.